Hi, Dave here from AlbionVC. Delighted to have Raza, CEO and founder of Humanloop, a business that spun out of UCL. You started as a PhD student and now you are the founder of an exciting, fast-moving business. I'd love to get your insight and reflections on that process. So Humanloop was founded in 2020 by yourselves, Jordan Burgess and Peter Hayes, together with Professor David Barber and Amina Yilmaz. You took initial pre-seed funding from the UCL Technology Fund, which Albion manage, and then later that year joined YC and then raised a seed round from Index Ventures, from Local Globe and from us, and have since raised further funding from existing backers. Really impressive set of founding backers and an amazing team. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the business and why it's so exciting?
Yeah, sure. Well, maybe I can start with the company and then tell you a bit about my own background and maybe the rest of the founding team. So, at its core, Humanloop helps companies who are building applications with large language models like GPT-4 or similar models to build those applications and make them reliable. So I think everyone heard about ChatGPT over the last year. The models have been around for a little while before that, actually. And there's a huge amount of work that goes between getting access to one of these models that has been pre-trained on the internet, has a whole bunch of world and language knowledge, but knows nothing about your private company, maybe isn't super reliable, and turning that into a production application that can either accelerate internal processes or do something useful for your end customers. And there's sort of a few problems that people face. One is evaluation is really, really hard. So for these models, because they are generating such a broad range of possible use cases and responses, like actually measuring quality becomes really difficult. So if you're writing a sales email for someone, like what is a good sales email? Or if you're Duolingo and you're creating a language learning assistant, like there isn't a correct answer for how a language learning assistant should respond. There's better or worse. And because it's hard to measure things, it's hard to develop the applications. And so we provide companies with a set of tools for both measuring how well these applications are actually working in an objective way, and then using that to drive performance improvements and for a whole product team to collaborate on building those models. And obviously, AI right now and large language models in particular are one of the most exciting tech transitions I think there's ever been. And it feels like we're at the beginning of an extraordinarily new wave of AI starting to work and really accelerate. So in terms of like why I think the current moment is exciting, I think we're at the start of probably the biggest tech transition in history. So it just feels a privilege to be part of that. I think the other part of your question was just like a little bit about myself personally. So in terms of academic background, I studied physics at Cambridge originally, and then did a master's and PhD at UCL in probabilistic deep learning. But similar to my co-founders, Peter and Jordan, was always interested in business, always interested in startups. So although I have on paper, a very strong academic sort of thread to it, there was always side projects and things going on in the background and involvement in companies. My first job out of uni was actually on the business development team of a venture-backed B2C startup. And Jordan and Peter, very similar. Both have previous company experience at the early stage. And so coming towards the end of the PhD, it was very natural for us to want to think about starting something. And then at the same time, this just absolutely extraordinary, it was a little bit earlier, but we were seeing it, I think, from academia sooner maybe than the rest of the world, where there had been a very obvious step change in computers' ability to understand language. And this was absolutely going to change how companies could operate, but probably they didn't have quite yet the right tooling to do it. And we wanted to go build that infrastructure.
Yeah, when we first met, or I first came across you, you were doing your PhD, but also moonlighting as the chief data scientist of a different startup from Imperial.
Yeah.
And obviously you founded Humanloop. You talked about that. It's clearly in your blood, or being an entrepreneur is something that is intrinsic to you. Why then go and do a PhD?
Oh, because it's fascinating, right? I mean, you don't do a PhD. For me, at least, it wasn't instrumental. It wasn't, I'm doing a PhD so I can go and achieve some other goal. The way the journey played out is that I was in my first job and I was really enjoying it, but it wasn't very technical. I was in a company called JustSpark, which I think has done very well, but it's not a deep technology company. And so sort of to scratch that itch on the tube to and from work, I started reading various textbooks. And I read this book by David Grimm, Information Theory, Inference, and Learning Algorithms. And I got super excited about it. I thought this was one of the coolest things I'd ever read about. And it was an opportunity to use all of the things I'd learned in physics, but in a way that was very tangibly, practically useful today. And so I got excited about that. I had this idea that I would go do a master's in machine learning and then I could start my own company, sort of trying to commercialize these like ideas. And this was sort of 2016-ish time, so still reasonably early. And that was the plan. I was going to go to UCL, do the masters, come out with a bit more expertise in machine learning, and then I wanted to start something. And I just ended up enjoying it way more than I expected to. I actually came top of the year at UCL, and so David approached me with the offer of a PhD place.
Right.
And I thought, how many times are you going to get a chance like that? And he was starting a new group at the time, and I knew a couple of the people who were joining the group, and they were super brilliant. So I, was attracted to the idea of also getting to work with them. And it kind of felt like, the opportunity to start a company would still be there. Yeah. And it didn't feel yet like AI was at a huge inflection point where it was sort of get in or you miss out.
Yeah.
And actually developing a bit more expertise, I think, has been really, really helpful for knowing, where the opportunities are.
And then in 2019, I remember I was speaking to David quite regularly about sort of ideas around the business world and how they could commercialize things out of his lab. And then you and I had a few conversations. It was really interesting to me how sort of businesses start and form and sort of coalesce. We'd love to get your perspective on how that came about and how you went from lots of interesting ideas to knuckling down and going for Humanloop.
Yeah, so I think so at the time the company was starting, I'd just come back from having done a long internship at Google. Yeah. And had sort of made my mind up about the fact that I wanted to try and start a company. That I didn't, the other obvious option for people coming out of a lab was go and join Google DeepMind or a similar industrial research lab. And I decided that wasn't what I wanted to do. So I was kind of clear on the path, but not clear yet on exactly what we would be doing. And so what I started doing is I wrote down a list of kind of the ideas that I was most excited about,
right,
and the people that I thought were the smartest that I knew. And I just started going and having lots of conversations with people. So Peter and Jordan were amongst those, David was amongst those. I spoke to a few others as well, actually. And, discussing my ideas with them, both trying to feel out people who I might want to work with, and also just testing initial ideas a little bit in the conversation with another smart person before testing them in the market.
Yeah.
In that process, Peter and Jordan and I sort of started, there was clear interest in possibly working together. And so we started doing side projects together. We did a big hackathon. We did other things, just also to kind of test working outside of the academic environment. And then also, we started sort of looking at the ideas we had. And there was definitely common threads through them. They were all motivated in some sense by the inflection in language understanding in computers. But once you've had this realization that, okay, computers can now understand language in a way they couldn't, there's many directions you could take that, and we had lots of different threads in our own research that could be useful. So then we started trying to build prototypes and speak to prospective customers, and just a lot of, trying to take, I can't remember who originally coined the term. I think it might be Balaji Srinivasan, but there's this idea I quite like of the idea maze, right? I think a lot of people have a misconception of startup ideas as there's a single idea. But I think the reality is that, if you start off with an idea let's stream video on the internet, well, that can be Netflix, and that can be YouTube, and that can be any other number of businesses. So, early on, you're trying to get down to the narrowest version of something so you can concretely build it and put it in front of people. And so I guess the first few months were mostly okay, taking an initial idea, which is, hey, why don't we make it phenomenally easier for more companies to get access to these great breakthroughs in natural language AI so they can apply them, it's such a general purpose technology, to then, okay, well, what are the actual bottlenecks? What are the problems they have? Who are the people building this? Who actually wants to do it? Where's the urgency to buy? Who's problem aware? And you're just charting thousands of little decisions to try and scope that out. And eventually you just have to launch something and then see what happens.
And was there a moment where the three of you said, right, this is it, we're all committing now, this is going to be what we do? And how did that come about, or was it more organic?
I think it was more organic than that. It was more, you're trying, you're within this space of initial hypothesis, and you've got this forking tree of possibilities and different paths that you might take, and then you're testing them against, the motto of YC I really like, because it really simplifies the goal of what you're trying to do early stage, which is make something people want.
Yep.
And so you're trying to figure out, does this solve a sufficiently burning problem for someone that they will take my janky, crappy, V0 prototype and use it because they don't have a better alternative and they need to solve it. And that's that's an iteration. It's an iterative process from an initial idea to the details rather than a particular moment. I guess when we got into YC, that like was a bit of a forcing function, because prior to that we were all still, finishing up PhDs and things like that. Once we were in YC, everyone went full time. But if had it not been for YC, it would have happened 3 months later. I don't think it would have been particularly different.
And the environment at the university, is it conducive to doing that kind of startup maze testing, do you think?
It is if you're a little naughty, in the sense that you're in a system where like you have a PhD stipend, and depending on your supervisor, you probably have quite a lot of freedom about how you spend your time, and no one's checking up on you. And so in that sense, yes, right? Because you don't have like a pressing financial pressure. You've probably also learned to live on not very much, which is I think like good prep. And you have the space to explore ideas. It's not good for your academic research if that's what you're doing. But in that sense, yes. And then I also think that like it gets you to the frontier of some field, and there's like you're in a milieu of ideas and aware of like what the boundaries are of what can and can't be done, which I think is great. I think it can be limiting in some ways as well, in that like you maybe are not as aware of the problems that people are facing in industry. Right. And a failure mode of this is like, having a solution in search of a problem. So I think it's like extremely beneficial for knowing the boundary of technology, being on the cutting edge, being surrounded by brilliant people, having people you can start a team with, the space and freedom to do that exploration, which I think is really hard when you have a full-time job. But you have to like then be really careful to like be honest with yourself about whether or not you really are solving a problem.
And you guys had all solved for that a little bit by having roles elsewhere, like prior to or during your PhD. So Google and Just Park, Jordan was at Bloomsbury AI, and Peter was.
And I mean when he joined us, he'd actually come from Amazon Alexa.
Exactly.
So he was in industry, seeing how this technology was being built.
Yeah, exactly. And universities like UCL, how can they help people like you? What can they do better? What sort of things in the environment are useful for people who are wanting to ideate? And what advice would you give to UCL to make sure the next 5 human loops are made?
So I actually think UCL is pretty good at this compared to other universities. I actually think that the main things universities can do is like recognize where their strengths are, and try not to do much outside of that, in the sense of like actually like sort of not getting in the way is I think more important. When you try to be helpful, sometimes you can create more problems than you solve. And so like I do think there's a less is more. I think like UCL does quite well is they're not punitive in the way they take equity stakes in companies. So actually if you're a student rather than an academic, I think they actually don't take any stake. They don't make a claim to your IP. And if you're an academic, even then, especially for computer science type parts, the equity stakes are very reasonable, which I think is not true at a lot of universities. I've had lots of friends, sneak out rather than spin out for that reason. So I think that's very good. The less bureaucracy and friction there is in starting your company, the better. I think, again, UCL is pretty good at this. Like, it was very quick for us we did license some IP, but it didn't feel like an onerous process. Beyond that, I think like trying to normalize the idea. So like culturally, just normalizing the idea that like entrepreneurship is something people can consider. I think that's really good. And then I wouldn't do anything else. Like, don't try to do accelerators. Don't try and teach people how to start companies. It's very rare that those programs add value. And I think more often than not, they're net negative, because they tend to be a distraction. Like, I actually think that YC is really good at this. So YC is a startup accelerator, but sort of if you're in it, it's remarkable how little contact time you actually have with them.
Right.
And what they really do is actually create a space that allows you to focus on the small number of things that really matter early on with like enormous speed. So during YC, I think there's like, you have 1-2 hour office hour a week or something, right?
Right.
But then you go and like try to execute really hard for that week before you come back. And it's like it's creating space for you to do, like, to be focused. Right. Whereas I feel like a lot of other things that people try to do to be helpful, they give talks and they put on programming and they do other stuff, is actually like sucking up time that would be better spent with like enormous focus trying to figure out how to get your business to the next level.
Got it. And you took pre-seed funding from the UCL Technology Fund. How did that help, and how did that sort of add to your early part of your journey?
Yeah, so for us, this was super helpful because it's 2020, so we were coming into the pandemic. And so we were really uncertain about the fundraising environment and what it would be like 6 months from now, what's going to happen. Thankfully it didn't turn out to be that bad, as everyone in VC knows, but it was hard to know at the time. And so there being like a fast, easy path that would allow us to have enough money to go and continue working on proof of concepts and get, basically have the safety of just enough money to get to that first milestone, I think was enormously helpful. And I actually think it tallies with a lot of I think the Chancellor in his most recent budget had a whole bunch of, advice related to spinouts, taking less punitive equity stakes, but also actually having these like proof of concept funds was one of the ideas. And I think it's a really good idea because it also allows you to delay taking like significant VC investment before you're early for it, like before you're ready for it.
Great, good. I'm always struck by the relationship between yourself, Jordan, and Peter. Like, it feels you have incredible respect for one another's ability and trust in one another. It feels very natural. But do you do anything to foster and nurture that? How do you make sure that continues? In particular, you're about to move to the US, as is Jordan. Have you thought about how you're going to continue to look after that relationship going forward as well?
Yeah. So, firstly, I think we're just really lucky. Like, Jordan and Peter are amazing. And so if you work with people who are incredible, it helps. And we do just have like a really high degree of trust. Yeah, they are both just like extraordinary people. Like, Peter is extraordinarily hardworking, has incredible people skills, whilst also being a great technologist, and has a PhD in machine learning, and covers all these bases. And then Jordan has this incredible like product sense and attention to detail. Like, he's the kind of person who in his day-to-day life is constantly noticing the design of everyday things and what isn't and isn't good. And we ended up being, despite looking very similar on paper, all with quite strong academic backgrounds, etc., like being surprisingly complementary, and so naturally kind of found roles that we enjoy. And I think we also really genuinely like working together, so that helps. We do stuff to like consciously work on the relationship.
Okay.
But we're doing it more recently as well. So we have like a weekly founder catch up, and we try to like make space for, giving each other, like, for the slightly more emotionally tense conversations as well as the day-to-day business ones, right? Like giving each other performance feedback or talking about, things we might be concerned about, and are we doing the right thing or are we not? Yeah. But to be honest, like, there's such a high degree of trust. It never feels that hard. So I think I wish I could give you a repeatable recipe, but I think we just got lucky.
Well, that's great. It does sound very organic and natural, and in some ways quite smooth, the whole first part of the journey. What was the most complicated or difficult thing in bringing Humanloop to birthing Humanloop or beginning it, do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm a very naturally optimistic person, and so like I always, even when I like look back at things, it always feels like everything was very smooth, and I'm trying to remember like what were the bumps and what were the things that were really hard. I think part of it is like we went in just expecting it to be phenomenally hard and not expecting it to be an overnight success, and just knowing that like we were likely going to have to grind at this for an extremely long time and try lots of different things and change ideas and hire people and find out that they didn't work out and have a big customer that we thought was going to close and then didn't close. But if you go in kind of expecting all of that to just be like part of it, and you're focused on just day-to-day kind of like solving the problems in front of you and thinking about, then it doesn't feel like ups and downs. It just feels like the natural part of the journey. And then, when you look at the core metrics in the background, like they are all slowly and then very quickly, like initially slowly and then increasingly fast over time, just growing.
Yeah.
And so I think something that really helped is just exposure to, and this is maybe you talk about like what could UCL or others do to like help in the ecosystem, is exposure to like other very successful founders telling you honestly what it was like at the stage of the journey where you are.
Right.
So, and this is somewhere where I think YC was really helpful, because they had this weekly dinner where someone like incredible, the founders of Airbnb or Mark Zuckerberg, where someone comes back and in a completely off the record setting tells it like it was in the first 6 months, year of the company, which is very different from the myths we all tell ourselves in retrospect.
Yes.
And once you kind of like are able to like see, okay, well, even that now multi-billion-dollar business or whatever it is, like had to go through these stages and like this is the path that you have to tread if you're going to build something super successful, then you stop worrying about it and you just get on with doing it.
Yeah, expecting it to be difficult and things to go wrong sounds like good advice for an early stage founder. What other advice might you give, particularly someone, either a PhD student or a postdoc who has started to think about a business idea and wants to get going? What other things would you impart to them?
So I think it's highly dependent on the type of business. I think a lot of companies spinning out of universities are often like deep tech and very capital intensive, and I know less about that. If you're kind of doing a big moonshot type company, then I think what I'm about to say probably applies less. But if you are going to try and go and build a product and sort of go to market with it quite quickly, then I think sort of having this question of like, make people something people want, like trying to be surprisingly narrow about who your target customer is and not being like worried about being too specific or going like too small.
Right.
At least early on, like it's better to have a small number of people who desperately need the thing and are willing to like tolerate it early on, because it's the first version, so unlikely to be perfect, is better. And also like letting the rubber hit the road quite quickly. So the other danger is spending, I think, like too much time in ideation mode or building quietly and not showing it to people. This doesn't mean necessarily that you need to like launch publicly or like do lean startup. I'm not advocating those things. But having a real customer with real problems who you're actually trying to solve for and getting feedback from them very quickly will help you avoid, I think, the mistake of like deceiving yourself into thinking you're solving a real problem when you're not.
Yeah.
The other thing I think is that it's really easy, it's become relatively easy, I think, for smart, talented people to be able to raise capital. And because of that, it's also easy to like be working on something that isn't actually working for a long time and not know it, or to hire lots of people too early or things like that. And so one, like delay, I think, raising capital until like you actually have found something that's working, you'll get better terms, and also like you're more likely to work on something that's meaningful. And then like don't scale prematurely. So you can go surprisingly far with a small team. One of my favorite examples of this is, I think, Retool, did their first $1 million of ARR. They were still a 2-person team. Wow. Okay, that's like the extreme end. But generally speaking, I think like the most successful product teams tend to be quite small, and adding people rarely makes things easier.
Yeah, got it. On funding, and this feels like a dangerous question for me to ask, but what have you learned about VCs and interacting with venture capital? What are the good things? What are the bad things?
It's mostly been really good, I would say.
Right.
I think like a lot of what we've learned is what motivates the investors, like how that aligns with the things we're trying to do, how to communicate the story, like fundamentally, and also like how to think about, what type of person you want. So learning that, okay, I mean, you just learn so much. You learn about the stages of capital and what different types of funds are like, and what is, when you're going to give up board seats and the terms that come in term sheets, and there's like so much that like details that you learn. Yeah. I think big takeaways for me was like focusing on the partner rather than the firm, like trying to find board members. We don't actually have a formal board yet, but even then, like thinking about the people, because you're going to spend a huge amount of time with those people, and inevitably things are not going to be going right all the time. And what was always a priority for me was trying to find investors who I knew I would be comfortable being honest about things not working as well as when they are working, because otherwise I think you just have a very fraught relationship and it's difficult to get the positive benefits of an investor who can be useful. And in terms of actually fundraising, I think like you want to try and maximize leverage in fundraising opportunities. And the best way to do that is to actually have a company that's working and to raise at moments of inflection. And so I think like a lot of people focus on the storytelling and they focus on, there's a popular conception of investors that comes from things like Dragon's Den, or I don't know, like how people form their views of investors. But if you want like leverage in a fundraising process, the only real way to do it as a founder is to have more than one offer. And the only real way to do that, I think, is to like have a company that's working. And so like when I think about fundraising, I think like 90%, like how do I make the business better? And then 10%, how do I tell the story and how do I manage investors?
Sure. Yeah, got it. And what's next for Humanloop? What's the next year looking like? What are you excited about?
Yeah, it's quite an exciting year. So we're opening an office in San Francisco, and Jordan and I are moving there to do that. And we've also just recently had quite a lot of growth with larger companies. So when we started the company by necessity, we were selling to SMBs and startups because we were right on the cutting edge of large language models, and most large companies hadn't even heard of the technology yet. Pre-chat GPT, there weren't that many enterprises who were building with this. The last year has really changed that. There's an urgency from much larger companies, and we've been pulled in that direction. And so increasingly, that's become the focus. And we're onboarding more and more of those. And so excited to work with them and just expand that part of the business. And then sort of building out the next stages of the product as well. So the core product today, I think I said a little bit at the beginning, right, solves two main problems for companies. One is, how do I evaluate these systems that are being built with AI that's so general? And then the other is that the way that a lot of language modeling technology now gets adapted is through what's called prompt engineering, this crafting of natural language instructions for the models. And that work gets done in an interdisciplinary way between product managers and engineers and other domain experts. And we give them a development environment in which to do this work coupled to that evaluation. And so, a concrete example might be a linguist at Duolingo crafting a lesson for someone, or sort of creating that, or someone in a customer service role, a product manager building a customer service tool, helping set up the system such that it's going to respond to customer success people, to customers for customer success. And so far what we've built has been, I think, very useful, but it's passive. It's monitoring and it's evaluation, and it's allowing people to drive the system. One thing I'm really excited about in the next year is actually the system starting to be proactive. So instead of just helping you by giving you analytics and giving you the tools, actually starting to make suggestions to you as to how you can improve your own product. And we have all the data and we have the AI now to be able to do that. So we can actually suggest a better prompt to you, or we can tell you, hey, based on the evaluation data, this thing is very expensive, but we think this cheaper model will perform just as well. Why don't you use that? And that's something I think will unlock a lot of value for people.
Cool. And lastly then, what advice would you give to us at Albion as we manage the UCL Technology Fund? How can we help startups? How can we bring forth the next generation of human loops? What can we be doing to turbocharge the ecosystem around universities in London?
Yeah, it's a good question. The things that I don't know the answer overall, so I can maybe just tell you the things that were helpful to me. Yeah. And maybe more of that would be helpful to others. So although I was always entrepreneurially inclined, I think it was helpful through programs like Entrepreneur First and other talks at university and things like that, getting exposure to other people doing it at a similar stage, and both normalizing the process, but also giving you the chance to speak to and learn from people, such that when you go to do it yourself, that becomes a little bit easier. And then I think something that, as I said, I'm moving to San Francisco. One of the stark differences between London and San Francisco I found is just the density of people who are working on similar things, the number of entrepreneurs who have been successful, the number of other technologists, the talent, the number of investors, etc. Yeah. There's much more of it there. And there's also a culture of people being willing to help each other without any obvious expectation of something in return.
Yeah.
And I think if we can find ways to foster that culture, so if we can create an ecosystem in which we all do that ourselves, yeah. And I remember early on you introduced me to a few angel investors who ended up being extremely valuable in the advice they gave us. And those connections to people were by far and away the most valuable thing that helped us early on, more than any teaching we got, probably actually more than the initial capital, though that was very helpful. And so fostering that community, connecting people, making it dense, trying to, and it'll snowball over time. That was what was most useful to me.
Great. Well, that's really helpful. Thank you so much for coming and spending the time with us.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure to be part of Humanloop's journey thus far, and so excited to see what's happening for the next year and beyond.
Yeah, I'm excited too.
Great.